we have to imagine that we have a given capacity for coping with noise exposure. People sometimes are not aware because it's something that it's kind of killing us little by little, day by day.
Neil here, and welcome to the On the Green Fence podcast. I hope that racket just now didn't put you off too much and that you're still there, because today we're looking at something that affects just about everyone. In fact, it's something that's difficult to avoid in the world we live in, especially if you're in a big city. Noise is part of our lives. Sometimes it's just in the background, other times it's really disruptive and makes it impossible to focus on anything else. Noise pollution is excessive sound, and there are many places it could come from, like a highway, rail and plane traffic, or a construction site. And if we're around too much of it over a long period, it can be harmful to our health. Now, exposure to loud noise can lead to heightened blood pressure, irritability, anxiety, fatigue, sleeping problems, and other issues. And it doesn't just stress us out, it can also be a problem for wildlife, interfering with animals on land and in the ocean that use sound to navigate, communicate, and to find a mate. The problem is only getting worse as cities and trade expand. So what can we do about it? And how can we avoid a noise overdose?
My name is Francesco Aletta. I'm a researcher.
This is Francesco Aletta's area of expertise. He's a researcher at University College London in the UK at the Institute for Environmental Design and Engineering. And he's interested in everything related to acoustics and how it impacts on our daily lives. So let's start off with the basics. What is the difference between sound and noise, and when does it become a problem?
Noise itself, the way we define it, is basically unwanted sound. Sound per se is neither bad nor good. So the moment there is something, this sound that is interfering with any kind of, action, expectations or comfort, then that becomes noise. So in many ways, we could say that a noise is just, the wrong sound in the wrong time and place. In terms of environmental stressors and pollutants that societies have to deal with, noise is certainly one of the most impactful. Actually, there is data showing from the World Health Organization that noise pollution is second only to air pollution when it comes to particulate matters and things like this. And that's something that people are not necessarily aware of. And that's the scary part, right? Because to use a metaphor, we could say, noise is kind of the silent killer. And that's really an issue. And from my point of view, the first step for dealing with that is actually increasing awareness.
I mean, you just mentioned that it can kill, right? I mean, I found this stat that according to the European Environment Agency, noise is responsible for 16,600 premature deaths in Europe alone every year. How can you establish that somebody has died of noise?
That kind of information should be interpreted in context. Like, it's not like noise will kill you instantly. I mean, it could make you deaf instantly. But then what the WHO is working with is kind of, long-term exposures. And that's where noise becomes a factor that plays a role in those kind of processes. And it's basically a comorbidity factor. So it contributes to premature deaths in a way that, for example, contributes to new cases of ischemic diseases or sleep disturbance. And all of those situations and clinical conditions then may potentially lead to death. And that's where, by actually reducing that kind of harmful noise exposure, you are actually, extending life expectation, really. So they use some slightly complex metrics that help you basically comparing scenarios where on one hand you have the pollutant, on the other hand you don't. In which scenario would the individual survive longer and things like this. So this is how they establish and they calculate this kind of impact. And to be honest, I think on one hand, it's a bit confusing, but I also think it's important that we have common tools and metrics to assess those kind of impacts, especially when we are dealing with health, because that's the only tool that actually policymakers have to make informed decisions. Something that is also important is also the cost of noise. So again, from WHO data, there is evidence that if we look at the European region alone, on average, noise will cost member states something ranging between the 0.2 and the 2% of the gross domestic product. And again, when you say cost, it's kind of a complex metric for saying impact on national health systems, responding to noise complaints, anything like that. So everything goes down into a single metric, boiled down to a number. But again, based on those numbers, regulators will then make decisions.
Francesco, you define noise pollution as unwanted sound, something that somebody doesn't want to hear but is forced to hear. If I look at the WHO also has a definition for noise pollution, and they put it at anything above 65 decibels is defined as noise pollution. Now that to me doesn't sound like a lot. 65 decibels. Does this mean that everybody is exposed to noise pollution every day at some time of day?
Yeah, again, that's a tricky number, right? So just to give the listeners some reference here, let's say a normal conversation between two people talking with a normal volume of voice at 1 meter apart, that would give the listener basically an exposure of 60 decibel in terms of sound pressure level. So 65 decibels really is, a very common level of exposure, something we experience in our daily life, especially if we live in cities and things like this. If you have that kind of exposures for prolonged intervals of time, then you will start observing the emergence of some adverse health effects. We have to imagine that we have a given capacity for coping with noise exposure and sound levels in general, and then we should aim not to saturate that on a daily basis. If we do that regularly, then we'll start observing adverse health effects. If you are in the proximity of a gunshot or a jet taking off, then that kind of peak, very short, impulsive noise, very loud noise could cause immediately some form of hearing impairment. But when we talk about cities, we're talking about much lower levels that last for much longer. So that's the concern. And that's also why people sometimes are not aware, because it's something that it's kind of killing us little by little, day by day.
That is also, I think, part of the problem, right? Because a lot of people just take it in their stride. You live in a city, you say, well, okay, I live in a city, so it's par for the course, it's a bit noisier, and you don't really think about it. But your science or your research is telling people we should be paying way more attention to this, right?
Indeed. Yes, that's exactly the case. And awareness and keeping track, monitoring our exposures to sound levels and noise in cities would be the first step. I was talking to a colleague, these days we have any kind of devices and wearable where we track our health and heart rate and how many steps we do in a day and things like that. I was thinking maybe if we integrated some kind of dosimeter or any kind of device able to measure our noise exposure, that would be the first step for people to really understand, oh, wow, then that's something that is actually affecting me. I should try to reduce, this kind of behavioral change. And it's very interesting, even at societal level, I've started noting now, when you go to reviews sites, websites for places for dining or, leisure facilities and things like that, you start picking up on reviews that mention the noise. And there are now apps that can point you towards quieter restaurants where you could have a kind of decent conversation. So in a way, I think this kind of awareness is growing, but we really need to work more in that direction so that we can see this kind of change that we need at societal level.
Francesco, noise pollution, it isn't just bad for us as humans, it's also bad for the environment, right? Can you perhaps elaborate just a little bit how big an impact it has on animal species, for instance?
There is plenty of literature and empirical evidence on this. So basically by creating anthropogenic noise, we are effectively disrupting natural ecosystems by, for example, occupying frequencies and space in the auditory realm that would be otherwise used by animal species for communication. And a lot of literature focuses on birds species, for instance, probably because they are easier to monitor. And there is evidence that these kind of species tend to adapt. And, for example, for communication, maybe they push their frequencies of communication a bit higher on the spectrum, because the normal frequencies that would be occupied by them are now occupied by, traffic noise. Mm-hmm. So that's like a straightforward impact. And it was very interesting during the first lockdown in the United States. There was a paper published by Derryberry and colleagues in Science, in the Science Journal, I think, where they said basically, because of the lockdown, there was a sudden drop, at least in traffic noise. And very quickly, some bird species, the white-crowned sparrows, for example, they kind of claimed back the auditory space, the frequencies that they would normally use. We freed up some space by taking traffic away. So that's also very telling because, when we say, animal species adapt, we may think, okay, they adapted, that's fine, right? But yeah. That's not fine at all, because what we are doing is just, putting loads on those kind of species. And as soon as they get the opportunity, as soon as the natural world has the opportunity, nature will actually try to, go back to what is more desirable from the ecosystem point of view. And in that case, communication for that kind of animal species was more effective at their natural and normal frequencies. Mm-hmm. In general, in the scientific literature, there is we are kind of skewed towards birds and avian species in general, because again, they are closer to us. They are also present in cities, of course, and they are easier to monitor in many ways. But there is plenty of evidence also about noise pollution affecting species in the oceans and in non-urbanized spaces, if you wish.
Mm-hmm. Before we go into the oceans, because what you just mentioned, it sounds to me like, if I were to just summarize that, it's like we create this noise as humans, and then the animals have to more or less adjust and perhaps even, talk louder, scream louder so that they can be heard. Yep. And there's miscommunication because of it, right? So, because I also read that some species, they have problems finding mates because then the female won't understand that the male is actually calling to them.
Exactly. So, this is affecting the ecosystems, and then birds will in turn affect, other kind of insects and bees, and everything is connected. It's not like, sounds naive, but that's the truth. So. That's the scale and magnitude of impacts that we have just with noise.
Yeah, but as you just said, they adapted. It was seen through the pandemic when things sort of went quiet again, that they went back to the original pitch. If I were sort of, looking at this with a sort of a critical lens and thinking, well, okay, things get noisy. We have to just alter our communication a bit. Maybe things are a bit louder. What's the big deal? Why can't we just adapt and the problem is solved? What do you say to that?
From the human perspective, as I said, there is evidence that we adapt, we die sooner. So it's not like we adapt to something. So of course we could put in place a number of coping strategies, but then there are implications to that. So it's not something like we should look forward to this kind of habituation mechanisms and adaptation things. Mm-hmm. I've recently read reports about how this is affecting some cognitive aspects for earlier students and pupils. So how exposure to traffic noise will affect learning abilities. So of course they adapt, okay? So they don't die from being exposed to road traffic noise in the very short term, but there are consequences that they will have to deal with in life. Mm-hmm. In some ways we could use metaphors also for related to climate change. Okay, the temperature is increasing, so what do? We install cooling devices. It's not like, it doesn't work like that. Mm-hmm. So we have to react to contain this.
Francesco, if coming back to the oceans then, you just mentioned that we're also impacting there on the animals living in the oceans with noise pollution. Can you perhaps give us some examples there, and just how bad is it what we're doing, in the oceans there?
I'm not an expert in ocean soundscapes, but in many ways it's always about communications. So big mammals, for example, would be affected in their communicating strategies, and that will affect again mating, as you mentioned. But also many species use sound mechanisms to navigate the oceans and for orientation. And it's not only about communications between individuals of the same species, it's also about orientation of the single individual getting lost, not being able to find their way because there is too much noise out there for them to orientate.
Francesco, if we look at the trends then, as you said, you drew the analogy to climate change. It's not something that we should just sit back and say, well, we'll just adapt. If it gets hotter, it's not a problem. This is a problem, noise pollution. But also the trends are going towards bigger cities, more people, more noise, more traffic, right?
Yes.
So, how do we break this trend? Is there any realistic option there to actually bring down the noise pollution?
So, as you said, basically, with increasing densities, there are more possibilities for, conflicts and in terms of expectations, and also, sources that we cannot foresee today. There are new types of noise sources popping up every day, and it's also difficult for the legislators to regulate those. So that's one aspect, technological development usually goes faster than the regulatory framework can catch up with. One thing I would say in terms of how do we break this negative loop is we should change our attitude in having a reactive approach to noise pollution. So the way we act usually is I realize there is a problem there. I go and I intervene with, a noise control device. The most obvious example is noise barriers, right? So there is a highway. Guess what? There is a dwelling, an estate close to that. So what do? We install noise barriers to actually protect, the residents from the noise. So that's a typical example of reactive approach. We deploy a solution when the problem is already there. So one way of countering that is basically having a proactive approach. So the first thing would be, I would say, taking all those kind of noise-related considerations very early on board when it comes to urban developments. In many ways, better planning and better urban design would solve a lot of noise issues in the first place.
Can you give us some concrete examples there, Francesco? What could be improved in terms of city planning to, bring down the noise level?
So first of all, is about making a careful study about, functions and stakeholders and expectations for the area. So if you have major infrastructure, running through a city, then probably in terms of land use, dwellings and residents is not the ideal function for the areas in the proximity of that major infrastructure. And I'm saying traffic, but that applies to anything really, like industrial plants and things like this. So sometimes it's the question about who came first. So and that's certainly a political issue. So if the noise polluting infrastructure, let's say, was already there, maybe the planning permission shouldn't have been granted in the first place. So that's what I mean when we talk about better planning and carefully considering that. Another aspect is that, of course, in cities at least, we will have to rethink mobility as a whole. So no matter how we look at this, road traffic noise is the problem. We have to move towards kinds of mobilities that do not depend so much on private cars, and if possible on engines at all. So creating incentives for cycling and even moving to some kind of electric mobility would certainly help, if not solve the problem. But we have learned a few lessons from the COVID experience. And I'm giving here the example of London. We did some kind of random measurements around the city during the first lockdown in 2020. And then we compared that kind of data with noise measurements we had, from pre-COVID, like 2018, 2019. Mm-hmm. You have to imagine this was, noise levels were sampled in different areas of the cities with different land uses and so on. But if we look at the average, of course, there were some kind of noise levels reductions, but not the kind of dramatic reductions that we would expect or that we would hope for. So those kind of reductions, for example, at least in London, wouldn't meet the thresholds recommended by the WHO.
Right.
So even when we stop society, when everything is freezed for a moment, and that's, of course, something that is not sustainable for a city on the long run, even then, we don't meet WHO recommendations.
Right.
That's why I say we have to rethink how we commute in cities and how we plan cities and design cities as a whole.
Yeah. So that would also suggest then that even if we just decarbonize everything, that won't do the trick. It's more structural than that.
Yeah, it is.
Perhaps just one final question then. I mean, how realistic is, that we'll be tackling this problem very soon? I mean, do governments, are they really aware of this problem yet? Are they taking note and doing things about this yet?
Yeah, again, from my personal experience, this year we published a chapter called Listening to Cities that was part of a report supported by the United Nations Environment Programme. And that kind of document is like what the UN thinks, should be priorities for environmental action. Mm-hmm. And just to give, the listeners some context, there were 3 chapters. One was about wildfires, so very visible and dangerous thing. Another one was about phenological changes under climate change, so the shifts in the rhythm of nature, why trees are blossoming when they are not supposed to. Mm-hmm. And then the third one was noise pollution in cities. On one hand, I think that's scary because, it's basically put there together with very visible and dangerous phenomena that people are concerned about. But then from my point of view, if I have to look at the bright side, I also think that that's a signal for something changing. So if the United Nations recognize that, then that's the kind of programmatic and policy documents that then governments, officials will actually look at for defining, national interventions and priorities for action. So the wind is changing in a way. Mm-hmm. And I also, part of that is also, a change in perspective in not only looking at noise as something that is detrimental, because that's noise, but also looking at how sounds can actually enrich our lives and how can we leverage on positive soundscapes for actually better places and more supportive and healthy environments.
Francesco, perhaps just to end on a personal note then, if we're talking about noise pollution, what to you personally is the most irritating noise that you would really like to get rid of if you could just wave your magic wand and you could get rid of it tomorrow? What would it be?
I would say it's road traffic for me. So I would confirm that. So in general, the feeling of opening the window and being overwhelmed by a column of traffic, that's something I suffer from it. And again, London is not exactly a rural area where you can enjoy sounds of nature. So yeah, I would say traffic noise is probably the most annoying one for me, at least.
Right. Francesco, thank you very much for your time and input. I do appreciate your expertise and sharing it with us here with On the Green Fence.
Thank you so much, Neil. Thank you for having me. It was a real pleasure.
Okay, now if you want to share the most irritating noise pollution sounds that you would like to get rid of, you can send us a sound file to onthegreenfence@dw.com, and I'll try and put together a best of irritating noises reel to play in one of our next episodes. That's it for now. Many thanks to my sound engineer Jürgen Kuhn and my colleague and co-producer Natalie Muller. We hope you enjoyed this episode of DW's On the Green Fence podcast and were able to take something away from it. My name is Neil King. Take it easy and take care.
On the Green Fence.